Oliver Drake had never been one to seek attention or validation. He was the type of man who appreciated silence, not as a lack of sound, but as a presence, a solid thing, like the feel of cool soil between your fingers or the creak of timber settling into place. After spending the bulk of his younger years working in agricultural development, hands deep in the soil of other men's land, repairing what others had exhausted, he'd finally saved enough to buy his own piece of earth. It wasn't much by corporate standards, but for him, 12.5 acres on the edge of the township was more than land. It was his answer to everything the world had tried to make him forget. Balance, patience, purpose. The plot had once been a neglected patch of rural scrub, mostly overgrown with prairie grass, tangled vines, and a few splintered remains of fence posts from some long-abandoned cattle boundary. Where most saw waste, Oliver saw potential. Not for development, not for some neat little suburban grid choked with ornamental trees and artificial turf, but for restoration. His vision wasn't about profit or appearances. It was about rare things. Wild clover that only grew in forgotten corners of the country. Medicinal herbs nearly lost to monoculture farming. Micro-ecosystems that thrived only in temperate chaos. So, he cleared carefully, not with heavy machinery but with selective tools and a borrowed pair of goats. He composted what he cut, leaving the rest for the insects and birds. Within 3 years, he had documented the return of 12 native species once thought dormant in the region, and several migrating bird populations had begun nesting again. A local college had even partnered with him for seasonal fieldwork, but Oliver didn't boast. He never installed signs or sought articles. He simply kept tending, season after season, recording in his journal when a new plant took hold or when the dew clung differently to the western hill. He was part of the land, not master of it. And that made people nervous. The surrounding subdivision had grown up fast and sloppy. Where once there were cow trails and old dirt roads, now sat long rows of identical beige homes with immaculate lawns cut so short they looked sterile. The people weren't unkind, but they didn't understand Oliver, and more importantly, they didn't try to. They saw his field from their kitchen windows and called it overgrown or untidy, or, in one woman's words, borderline feral. At the head of that growing discomfort was Karen Hobbs. Karen was the kind of person who spoke with certainty about things she didn't fully understand. She had a commanding voice and a wardrobe that always included something floral, even in winter. She ran the neighborhood committee with the precision of a traffic warden and the warmth of a parking citation. Her front lawn had solar-powered garden gnomes, 2 white trellises, and a laminated sign that read, "Be kind or be gone." She was not a woman to be reasoned with, only appeased or avoided. For a long time, Oliver did just that. He nodded when they crossed paths near the post office. He listened without comment when she complained about "that wild thicket of yours" during grocery checkout. He even gave her a jar of his chamomile tincture one Christmas. It didn't matter. He was the weed man to her. The guy with the mosquito field. Her campaign against his land wasn't overt, not yet, but it had been simmering for months. Rumors, whispers, passive-aggressive posts in the neighborhood newsletter about property value threats and unsupervised wildscapes. Then came the park project. It started innocently enough. A printed flyer in everyone's mailbox. Help beautify our neighborhood. Let's bring nature to the people. There were buzzwords like wellness, playground zone, and walking trail integration. There was even a digital rendering, complete with cheerful children, leaping dogs, and a yoga mat area facing the sunset. Karen had gathered signatures and support faster than Oliver thought possible. But something caught his eye on the digital plan. Something that felt wrong in his bones. His property. Not named outright, of course, but the area labeled Natural Meadow Restoration Zone had his topography, his ridge lines, even the damn hawthorn he'd trimmed by hand. When he called the listed number and calmly pointed out the mistake, he was told it was likely a mapping glitch, that of course no one intended to develop private property. "It's just conceptual at this stage, sir," the voice said, friendly but detached. "Don't worry, there's no intention to interfere with anyone's legal boundaries." But intentions didn't matter much the morning the machines arrived. It was earlier than usual. Oliver had just put the kettle on when he heard the diesel growl outside. Not a passing truck. Stationary. Consistent. He stepped out onto his porch and froze. A bright yellow bulldozer was idling just beyond his fence line. Two men in high-visibility vests were pulling orange tape between wooden stakes, pushing through the brush like it didn't matter. A white utility truck was parked awkwardly on the edge of his gravel drive, its hazard lights blinking in slow, indifferent rhythm. One of the men, a younger guy with a clipboard, glanced at Oliver and gave him a casual wave, as if he were watching a neighbor put out trash cans. Oliver didn't wave back. He walked straight up to the tape line. "Morning," the man said, chewing on a granola bar. "Bit of a mess here, huh?" Oliver's voice was even, but his jaw was locked. "What are you doing on my land?" The man blinked. "Sorry. This is my property." "What are you doing on it?" The man looked at his clipboard, then back at the clearing behind them. According to the site plan, this area is under the green light for pre-scrape, part of the naturalization project. Should be about 6 acres. Which 6? Zone 3, I think. Look, I just do ground prep. If you've got questions, you'll need to talk to the planners. I think they cleared it already last month. I didn't clear anything. The man hesitated. Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe. Wait, are you Drake? I am. A short pause. Then the man stepped back and said nothing else. But behind him, the bulldozers started moving. Not fast, but forward. The blade lowered, angled slightly. With a jolt, it began tearing through the soft, dew-heavy earth, scraping aside clusters of fireweed, snapping through goldenrod like bone. Oliver didn't shout. He didn't rush forward. He simply turned and walked back to his porch, picked up his phone, and dialed the only attorney in town he halfway trusted. Voicemail. He left a message, concise and steady. Then he made 3 more calls. One to the land records office, one to a boundary surveyor, and one to a contact at the college's environmental science program. By the time the sun was fully overhead, 3 full rows of his field were gone. Flattened. The scent of crushed earth was thick in the air, tinged with diesel. And somewhere, just past the sound of machines, he could hear Karen's voice laughing lightly through an open window 2 streets over. He stood there a long time, jaw tight, hands at his sides. Then he walked to the back of the house, opened a storage locker, and pulled out the thick brown folder labeled Drake vs. County, 2009. It was the last time someone underestimated how far he would go to protect what was his, and this time he didn't plan to fight quietly. The bulldozer hadn't returned the next day, nor the day after, but the damage had already been done. By the end of the week, the strip they'd cleared across Oliver's field was a pale, open wound in the earth. The grasses had been shredded to the roots. The low-growing herbs he'd spent seasons coaxing into balance had been ripped up and discarded like waste, and the soft soil that once held colonies of mycorrhizal fungi was now packed down with the crude indifference of steel treads. He didn't bother fencing it off or covering it up. Let them see what they had done. Let the entire neighborhood stare into it every time they walked past the edge of his property and try to call it progress. He didn't water the rest of the field that morning. He spent it instead indoors, rereading every page of the property deed, scanning through parcel maps and checking dates and notations that hadn't meant much to him in years. Everything was in order. His ownership extended 60 feet beyond where the grading had begun, and the boundary had been surveyed and recorded 4 times in 15 years. But that didn't stop what happened. The paperwork, it turned out, was never the issue. The issue was that no one bothered to check. By noon, his inbox was filling with vague apologies and voicemails from concerned parties. An administrative assistant from the landscaping contractor called to clarify the sequence of events, reading from a prepared statement that mentioned a misalignment of regional parcel overlays and an unintentional misreading of jurisdictional grids. It was nonsense, bureaucratic cover for someone's haste, or, worse, someone's deliberate omission. Oliver didn't interrupt. He took notes, asked for names, and requested a copy of the work order and planning documents. The assistant hesitated, but eventually agreed to email them once authorized. What arrived instead was a low-resolution scan of a generic site map with a circle scribbled in red marker over what had once been his north slope. The header read Naturalization Zone 3. There was no signature, no legend, no stamp of approval, just a file name, date, and a three-letter code he didn't recognize. The company had labeled it a preliminary sketch, but the damage had been executed as final. There was no maybe in the blade of a bulldozer. At Fairmount p.m. sharp, Oliver received a knock at the door. Karen Hobbs, naturally, dressed in a neatly pressed lavender blouse, a binder clutched under one arm, and a look of mild condescension that was probably her default setting for confrontations she believed she was winning. She stood at the edge of his porch like it belonged to her and smiled in that precise way people do when they're about to lie but want you to feel bad about not agreeing. "I thought I'd stop by," she said, her voice rehearsed. "There's clearly been a bit of confusion. I just came from the Community Advisory Board and, well, there was some miscommunication between the project group and the grounds team. I told them you might have concerns." Oliver stepped outside but didn't invite her in. "You gave them permission to come onto my land." Karen blinked, feigning surprise. "Oh, goodness no. I don't have that authority, Oliver. You know that. I'm just a facilitator, a communicator. The contractors work off city guidance. There's no city involvement," he said flatly. "I called them." Karen's face twitched for half a second before resetting into her practiced calm. "That's precisely the kind of misunderstanding we're trying to clear up. This was never intended to be adversarial. We all want the same thing: beauty, safety, usability." "I want the things I planted back in the ground," Oliver said. "And I want the soil repaired, not sterilized." Karen clucked her tongue sympathetically. "I understand your emotional connection, but let's not overstate the environmental value of a few wild grasses. Most of what was removed were invasives. Besides, the board passed a motion last month to begin the preliminary layout for the Greenway extension. You passed a motion involving private land? Oh, it wasn't specific to your parcel." She smiled tightly. "It was more of a conceptual zone alignment, and it passed unanimously." He stared at her. "Karen, what you're describing is not conceptual. Someone approved heavy machinery to destroy active planting zones without consent or due diligence. That's actionable. You know that, don't you?" She blinked again. "Let's not turn this into a legal matter. No one wants to go down that road." Oliver said nothing. He stepped inside, returned with a manila envelope, and handed it to her. "This is a formal notice of land intrusion and demand for restitution. My attorney drafted it this morning." Karen's smile froze, thinned, and then faded altogether. "I see. You'll also find a request for the full decision log from your board regarding this project, and any correspondence with the contractor. If you're not able to produce it, my lawyer will subpoena it." The weight of silence hung between them for a moment before Karen finally turned and descended the porch steps, her binder now clutched more tightly than before. "You know," she said over her shoulder, "these kinds of disputes have a way of reflecting poorly on everyone involved. Neighbors see hostility. It causes tension." Oliver didn't respond. He simply closed the door. That night, as the crickets emerged cautiously into the disrupted field, and the wind sifted through the trampled remains of what had once been full stalks of sweetgrass and golden aster. Oliver sat with a thermos of black coffee and wrote down every detail he could recall: the placement of stakes, the orientation of tire marks, the names on the vests, the time the equipment arrived, the serial number on the white truck's registration sticker. It was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a strategy. Coordinated, quiet, and disguised as benevolence. The kind of strategy that relied on fatigue, on resignation, on silence. But he wasn't tired, and he wasn't silent. At sunrise, he called a surveyor out of state, an independent contractor who'd worked with him before and didn't answer to local pressure. He asked for a full-site rescan and made sure it included drone footage. He then drove to the district office and filed a formal report of property damage, attaching his parcel data and a list of protected species confirmed by the university's ecology team. By noon, the report had triggered a compliance review. 2 days later, he received a notice slipped under his door. It was printed on heavy stock paper, with the committee's letterhead at the top and Karen's name signed in curling blue ink. It read, in part, "We regret the unfortunate incident and hope to reach a neighborly resolution. Please be advised that your field has been designated for future community enrichment and is currently under project evaluation status. Construction may resume pending review." They weren't backing off, and now he knew they never planned to. Oliver didn't sleep much in the week that followed. Not from fear, not from anger, but from sheer mental friction. His mind turning over details, legal angles, timelines, motives, and costs. What they had done wasn't just a mistake, and it wasn't just a nuisance. It was a test, intentional or not. A quiet bet that he would shrug, mutter a few curses under his breath, and let it go. But he wasn't wired that way. And more importantly, the land wasn't something he viewed as flexible. It wasn't a patch of grass to be reshaped for jogging paths or amateur gardening clubs. It was a system, a small ecology he had tended like a second heartbeat. It had meaning, even if no one else around him recognized it. The independent surveyor arrived on a Thursday morning, driving a weathered van that looked like it had once belonged to a traveling tinkerer. Greg Foley had worked with Oliver once before, years back when there had been a boundary dispute over a fence line with a neighboring farm. Greg was quiet, methodical, and, most importantly, disconnected from the local bureaucracy. He worked alone, double-checked everything by hand, and printed results on paper you could actually hold. After 2 days of mapping, drone footage, and elevation readings, Greg confirmed what Oliver already knew. The encroachment wasn't accidental. It extended 34 feet into Oliver's documented parcel. Moreover, the destruction cut through 2 of the densest growth zones in his restoration plan, wiping out nearly 6 years of work. There was no grid error or coordinate overlap. The bulldozers had gone exactly where someone had directed them to. With the survey in hand, Oliver turned his attention to documentation. He printed high-resolution stills from the drone's flyover and overlaid them onto his original project maps. He highlighted the damaged sections in red, annotated soil density losses, and calculated a conservative cost for ecological repair. Then, calmly and without bluster, he mailed a full packet to his lawyer, to the town's public works office, and, deliberately, to the committee's administrative desk with Karen's name on it. 3 days later, an envelope appeared in his mailbox, hand-delivered, without postage. Inside was a single printed page on cheap paper. No signature, no heading, just a line in 14-point font. "You're being unreasonable. This land has been dormant for decades. Let progress happen." Oliver read the note once, then folded it neatly and slipped it into a folder marked Incidents, Phase 1. He made no reply. Instead, he filed a formal complaint with the County Land Commission. Unlike the neighborhood's advisory board, the commission had teeth, especially when it came to unapproved grading on private land. It wasn't a flashy move, and it wouldn't spark headlines or send anyone into hiding, but it was real, legal, and quietly potent. Within 72 hours, he received confirmation that the commission had opened a review. That meant someone, possibly multiple parties, would be subpoenaed for documentation, and any further activity on his land would constitute interference with an open investigation. That also meant the committee's pet project was now under official scrutiny, something bureaucrats hated more than lawsuits: delays and attention. That same week, Oliver received 2 unexpected visits. The first was from a local landscaper. Young guy, probably no older than 25, who arrived in a branded pickup and introduced himself as Dylan. He was polite, almost apologetically so. Said he was subcontracted through a company called Verde Plains, which had been hired to beautify transitional zones along the planned greenway. When Oliver asked if he'd received documentation confirming jurisdiction, Dylan hesitated, glanced at his phone, and then shrugged. "They just told me to start prepping the slope next week," he said. "I didn't even know this was your land. They didn't say anything about it being private." Oliver asked for the order form. Dylan showed him an email with attachments, including a site plan labeled Zone 3C, Southern Transition Pathway. The overlay again included Oliver's slope. This time, the markings were more deliberate, hand-drawn indicators of where benches should be installed, a mulch path winding exactly through what had once been a patch of young native thistle. There was even a note about installing decorative lighting on the ridge viewpoint, which ironically was a place Oliver had spent the last 6 months slowly cultivating soil to support milkweed. He thanked Dylan, took photos of the documents, and asked him, gently, not to return until the commission completed its review. Dylan nodded and left. 2 hours later, the email thread between Dylan and Verde Plains disappeared from the server. Oliver only knew because he'd asked a contact from the university, someone with web archive tools, to capture it before it vanished. He printed the entire thread and added it to the folder. The second visitor came at dusk 2 days later and wasn't nearly as polite. Oliver had just come in from marking off the most damaged section of the northern parcel with caution tape and solar lanterns when he heard a car engine rev down the drive. It was a black sedan, windows tinted. A woman stepped out. He recognized her from one of Karen's meetings, a stern-looking type who had once accused him of hoarding weeds during a zoning review last year. She didn't identify herself. She simply walked up the drive, held out a document in a plastic sleeve, and said, "This is a courtesy notice. You've been reported for improper fencing, obstruction of community land, and failure to comply with neighborhood beautification standards." Her tone was neutral, but her eyes carried a challenge. She didn't expect him to fight back, just to fold. He took the document, didn't respond, and watched her leave. Once inside, he reviewed the contents. It was unsigned, poorly formatted, and riddled with vague legal language. The real bombshell, though, was a small paragraph buried at the bottom that stated, "Failure to remove unauthorized fencing within 7 days will result in a formal complaint and possible fine of 5,000 SORs." That was the opening move. They were no longer pretending it was about green space. They were attempting to turn his defense into a violation, flip the optics, make the victim look like the aggressor. Oliver didn't dismantle the fence. He made copies of the notice, added it to his file, and then called his attorney. They submitted a cease and desist letter the next morning to both Verde Plains and the community board, citing pending investigation, illegal encroachment, and documented loss of protected species. But the biggest turn came when he visited the regional herbarium center later that week. A botanist he'd worked with during the clover restoration project, Dr. Mendez, informed him that one of the native species affected by the bulldozer, Eryngium leavenworthii, or Leavenworth's eryngo, was currently being evaluated for protected status in the state due to habitat loss. The fact that his land had hosted 3 confirmed plots and that they were destroyed during unauthorized construction changed the stakes. Mendez agreed to file an affidavit as a witness and submitted the incident to the state ecology registry for review. Suddenly, it wasn't just a field anymore. It was an environmental incident. Oliver returned home that evening and stood at the edge of the ruined slope, now partially eroded from days of wind and minor rain. He looked out over what used to be his pollinator basin and saw only raw, cracked ground. And yet he didn't feel defeated. He felt focused. For every layer they stripped away, he was peeling back another from them. Legal, procedural, reputational. He knew what they were hoping for, that he'd push too hard, too soon, act erratic, give them grounds to call him unstable, bitter, combative. But he wouldn't give them that satisfaction. He wouldn't raise his voice. He wouldn't rant at meetings. He'd do the one thing they weren't ready for. Outlast them, out-document them, outmaneuver them. The fight wasn't over land anymore. Now it was about principle. And Oliver had just found his second wind. Oliver wasn't naive enough to believe that bureaucratic systems moved quickly. He knew that filing complaints, assembling evidence, and navigating county reviews could take weeks or even months, particularly when the opposition had influence over local committees and could lean on procedural delays. But he also knew that patience, coupled with precision, was its own weapon. Every day, he added another line to his file. Photos of the degraded soil, new emails confirming communication gaps between the landscaping company and the so-called neighborhood board, notarized letters from experts, and, most importantly, a growing ledger of procedural violations. He wasn't merely building a complaint, he was constructing a siege, slow and methodical, around the fragile foundation of the entire project. By the second week, Oliver's case had reached a tipping point, although few outside his immediate contacts knew it yet. The regional herbarium had formally submitted a report to the State Conservation Department listing his parcel as a potential conservation site, citing the destroyed plots of Leavenworth's Iringo as a primary reason. The legal designation would take time to process, but the mere filing of the paperwork forced an automatic provisional protection status under state law. This status triggered an environmental impact review requirement on any pending projects within a 100-foot radius. It meant that even if Karen's group tried to muscle through beautification, they would now be legally obligated to commission expensive ecological assessments that would inevitably reveal their previous destruction. Oliver didn't gloat when he read the provisional notice. He simply folded it, placed it carefully into his growing case binder, and made an appointment with his attorney to prepare a formal injunction request. He knew the moment of open confrontation was approaching, and he needed to be ready when it did. The next ripple hit not long after. One morning, Oliver found a printed flyer taped to his mailbox. It bore the familiar pastel logo of the community board and an enthusiastic headline: Upcoming Town Hall, Greenway Expansion Celebration. In smaller print, beneath the cheerful graphic of trees and benches, was an announcement of a public presentation by Karen Hobbs and guest representatives from Verde Plains. The flyer made no mention of pending investigations, environmental concerns, or land ownership disputes. It presented the project as a done deal, a celebratory event with light refreshments and prize drawings for attendees. Oliver smiled thinly as he read it. It was bold, almost desperate, a blatant attempt to shape the public perception before the facts caught up. He understood the strategy perfectly. If they could frame the project as beneficial and joyful in the community's mind, anyone opposing it would be seen not as a defender of principle, but as a petty obstructionist. They weren't trying to win legally. They were trying to win emotionally, socially, and they were betting that most residents wouldn't bother looking too closely at the details. Oliver didn't waste time posting rebuttals online or arguing with neighbors. Instead, he attended the town hall himself, sitting quietly at the back of the community center as families trickled in, chatting and helping themselves to cookies and lemonade. Karen was in her element, radiating authority and charm, moving from conversation to conversation with the smoothness of a practiced politician. She wore a bright coral jacket and smiled warmly as she welcomed residents, her voice carrying through the room with easy enthusiasm. The presentation began with a slideshow of computer-generated park models, lush walking trails, gleaming playground equipment, shaded benches along manicured pathways. Karen spoke of community unity, of reclaiming underutilized spaces, of bringing nature into our lives. Applause broke out after each point, light but sincere. People wanted to believe her. They wanted the fantasy she offered. Then came the question session. Oliver raised his hand. Karen faltered for half a second when she saw him but quickly recovered, gesturing magnanimously. "Yes, Mr. Drake. Thank you for joining us. Do you have a question?" He stood slowly, holding the microphone loosely at his side. "Has an environmental impact assessment been conducted for Zone 3C?" There was a flicker, brief but unmistakable, of discomfort in her smile. She pressed on. "Well, Mr. Drake, preliminary assessments were reviewed by our partners at Verde Plains and—" "Reviewed," Oliver interrupted calmly. "Or conducted. Because state law requires a formal environmental impact study before any development on protected parcels, provisional or otherwise." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Karen straightened. "We've complied with all necessary guidelines. Have you disclosed the pending investigation filed with the County Land Commission regarding unauthorized clearing activities on private property?" Oliver asked, voice steady. There was a pause, heavier this time. Karen's smile tightened at the edges. "This meeting is meant to celebrate our future, Mr. Drake, not dwell on procedural hurdles." Oliver let the silence linger before replying. "The future you're celebrating was built on trespass and destruction. I have sworn affidavits, independent surveys, and a formal complaint with the Conservation Office to back that statement." Gasps and murmurs grew louder. A man near the front row frowned and leaned toward his wife, whispering something. Karen's composure cracked. Her voice sharpened slightly as she said, "Mr. Drake is entitled to his opinion, but progress often requires difficult decisions. We're creating something beautiful for everyone here." Oliver didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Beauty built on theft doesn't last." And with that, he sat down, handing the microphone to the stunned moderator. Karen hurried through the rest of the presentation, her words a little less fluid, her posture a little less commanding. Oliver didn't stay for the prize drawings. He left the town hall with no fanfare, driving home through the dark, his mind calm and focused. He knew public opinion wouldn't change overnight. Many would still cling to the comforting vision Karen had offered them, preferring not to examine the messy underbelly of how it was obtained. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and seeds, he knew better than anyone, had a way of growing if given even the slightest crack of light. That night, he sat on his porch, overlooking the damaged land. The stars were clear above, cold and sharp. He thought about the years it had taken to coax life back into this field, about the trust he had placed in systems that were supposed to protect it, and he thought about how easy it would be to give in, to sell, to move, to let it go. But the truth was simple. They hadn't just torn up some wild grass. They had tried to erase something irreplaceable, something cultivated with intention and care. And they had underestimated how hard a man could fight when everything that mattered wasn't just written in paperwork but rooted deep in the earth under his feet. Tomorrow, he knew, the real battle would begin, and he was ready for it. Oliver awoke before sunrise, not from noise or dreams, but from the restless certainty that something had shifted. The fight was no longer contained to formal letters and hearings. It had evolved, turned darker, more desperate. By the time the first pale light crept across his field, he had already brewed coffee, checked his notes, and pulled a canvas jacket over his shoulders. His instincts were proven right an hour later when he walked the perimeter of his property and found the first signs of retaliation. Someone had dumped several bags of construction debris across the access path leading up to the western ridge. Broken tile, rebar, splintered 2x4s riddled with nails. Not in a careless scatter, but methodically, deliberately, enough to block foot traffic and make the route unsafe. Oliver stared at the mess for a long moment, his hands tightening at his sides before methodically beginning to photograph every pile, every footprint, every tire track leading away from the site. He measured the width of the tire impressions, standard truck width, and noted the faint traces of oil drips near the main gate. It wasn't just vandalism, it was a message. Instead of removing the debris immediately, Oliver flagged the area with caution tape and filed a property damage report with the county sheriff's office, attaching all the photos and measurements. He had no illusions that the report would result in arrests. The law rarely moved that quickly for minor offenses. But it wasn't about justice in the short term. It was about the paper trail, about building undeniable momentum, layer by layer, against whoever believed they could pressure him into surrender. Later that morning, a certified letter arrived. It was from a law firm he recognized as the same one that often handled disputes for the local board, a firm notorious for its aggressive tactics in property conflicts. The letter accused Oliver of creating a public nuisance, citing his caution tape and flagged areas as unauthorized modifications of community right-of-way. It demanded that he cease and desist, or face daily fines accumulating to thousands. Within weeks, Oliver read the letter twice, his expression calm. It was a bluff, and not even a good one. His land wasn't part of any right-of-way easement. The maps and surveys proved that beyond any doubt. But the tactic was clear. Overwhelm him with threats, legal fees, bureaucratic intimidation. Make him bleed out through attrition rather than confrontation. He didn't respond directly. Instead, he forwarded the letter to his attorney and attached a notarized copy of his boundary survey. Then he called his insurance adjuster and added harassment escalation to his existing damage claim. The next move came faster than expected. 2 days after the debris dump, work crews arrived without warning. This time it wasn't bulldozers. It was landscaping crews with chainsaws and brush shredders, accompanied by 2 white pickup trucks displaying magnetic signs reading, "Beautify Our Neighborhood Initiative." They set up on the adjacent public easement, not technically on his land, but dangerously close to the boundary line, trimming aggressively, grinding brush into mulch, throwing dust and shredded debris into the air. Oliver watched them from his porch for a full 10 minutes, noting the absence of supervisors, the lack of posted permits, the hasty, careless work. Then he went inside, retrieved his folder containing the county's provisional environmental protection notice, and walked directly to the edge of his property where the workers were active. He didn't shout or threaten. He simply held up the folder and said, loud enough for all of them to hear, "Any material removed within 30 feet of this boundary is subject to provisional ecological protection under state law. Any disturbance will be documented and reported." The effect was immediate. The workers hesitated, glanced nervously at one another. Some continued half-heartedly, pretending not to hear. Others stopped altogether, stepping back and murmuring into radios. Within an hour, the trucks pulled out, the crews dispersing without explanation. They had no appetite for becoming the scapegoats in a brewing legal storm. But Karen and her allies didn't back off. That evening, Oliver found that his mailbox had been plastered with bright orange violation tags. 6 of them, all identical, citing vague infractions like unsanitary landscape conditions and visual blight affecting neighborhood morale. It was laughable on its face, but each tag carried a fine, and together they threatened a cumulative penalty of nearly $10,000 if corrective measures weren't taken within 30 days. Oliver didn't tear them down in anger. Instead, he carefully removed each notice, photographed it, and logged the exact time and date. He then walked down the road to the main community bulletin board, where public notices were required to be posted, and found no record of any new ordinances or regulations regarding property standards. In short, the citations were fabricated, improvised scare tactics with no legal basis. He sent the entire package to his lawyer along with a formal request to the county to initiate an audit of the committee's enforcement actions over the past 6 months. That request, once filed, would freeze any fines or penalties until the audit was complete, effectively neutralizing the threat of compounding financial pressure. And yet, even as Oliver moved through each countermove with steady precision, he knew this wasn't sustainable forever. The committee wasn't acting randomly. They were escalating deliberately, trying to provoke him into a mistake, a moment of aggression, a rash lawsuit that could be turned against him. Then came the late-night knock. It was nearly midnight, and Oliver had just set down the journal he used to record daily observations on field conditions. The knock was sharp, insistent. He rose cautiously, turned on the porch light, and peered through the side light window. 2 uniformed deputies stood on his front step. He opened the door slowly, stepping outside without invitation. "Can I help you?" One of the deputies, a heavy-set man with a tired expression, shifted uncomfortably. "We received a report of unauthorized land disturbance and possible environmental hazard activity at this location." Oliver's face remained neutral. "From whom?" The deputy hesitated. "Anonymous tip." Oliver nodded slowly. "You're welcome to take a look from the road. You'll find no active disturbance, and you'll find documentation of provisional ecological protection on file with the county." The other deputy, younger and clearly uneasy, glanced down the driveway at the faint outlines of the flagged boundary zones. He muttered something to his partner, who shrugged. "We'll file a report noting no visible violation," the older deputy said after a pause. "Sorry for the disturbance." Oliver watched them leave, his heartbeat steady, his mind already cataloging the new layer of harassment. Anonymous tips, deputized intimidation. It wasn't going to stop because he had filed complaints. It was going to escalate precisely because he had struck a nerve. Back inside, he poured himself a glass of water and sat in the darkened kitchen, replaying the night's events. They were trying to paint him as unstable, hostile, dangerous, someone who needed to be controlled or removed for the good of the community. It was a familiar playbook. He had seen it used in other towns, against other people who stood in the way of convenience and easy profits. But they had miscalculated something fundamental. Oliver wasn't isolated, he wasn't uninformed, and he wasn't angry in the way they expected. His fury was cold, deliberate, the kind that didn't lash out but bore down with inexorable pressure until the opposing structure cracked under its own weight. Tomorrow he would start the next phase. Tomorrow he would make them wish they had simply left him alone. Oliver woke with the certainty that this would be the day everything broke open. It wasn't optimism. It was inevitability. The forces arrayed against him had pushed too far, too publicly, and too carelessly. Their tactics had left fingerprints all over the mess they had created, and now, finally, the weight of their accumulated arrogance was about to crash down on them. The morning air was cold and sharp as he dressed, layered in work clothes that could pass for either field labor or a court appearance. His lawyer, Samantha Kerrigan, called him just after 8. Her voice, usually dry and measured, carried a rare note of satisfaction. The County Land Commission had completed their preliminary review. Their findings were simple and devastating. Unauthorized encroachment onto private property, failure to obtain environmental clearance before land modification, destruction of protected flora, and misrepresentation of property boundaries in public documents. Moreover, the records revealed that the so-called Community Board, under Karen Hobbs's leadership, had submitted grant applications using falsified site maps and descriptions, knowingly omitting the presence of private holdings. In short, fraud. The commission had referred the matter to the district attorney's office for potential civil and criminal proceedings. In parallel, the Conservation Department issued a formal cease and desist order against any further alterations within a half-mile radius of Oliver's property, pending a full environmental impact assessment. The penalty for violating the order? A minimum fine of $50,000 per incident, plus potential injunctions against future land use projects led by any member associated with the fraudulent grant applications. Samantha had already drafted the civil suits, one against Verde Plains Landscaping for trespassing and ecological damage, one against the individual members of the committee for conspiracy to commit fraud, and one directly naming Karen Hobbs for abuse of position and willful property destruction. It was almost too clean, too perfect, but Oliver knew better than to celebrate early. He moved carefully through the day, organizing his documentation, confirming witness lists, and preparing his statements. At noon, the community center hosted an emergency meeting, hastily convened under the guise of a project update. But everyone knew what it really was: damage control. Oliver didn't attend at first. He waited outside, leaning against his truck in the parking lot, watching as residents filtered in with uncertain expressions. Some carried tote bags emblazoned with the Greenway Project logo, but their steps were slower, their greetings muted. Word had spread. Maybe not the whole story yet, but enough to sour the air. Inside, Karen stood at the front of the room, radiant in a bright teal jacket, her smile stretched taut over simmering panic. She launched into a speech about unexpected procedural reviews and temporary setbacks, spinning the commission's findings as routine bureaucratic hurdles. She invoked phrases like unfortunate miscommunications and regulatory overreach, painting herself and the board as victims of red tape. It might have worked, might have bought her another few weeks of illusion, if not for what happened next. Midway through her presentation, two uniformed officers entered the room. Not local deputies, but investigators from the district attorney's office. They approached Karen quietly, presented her with a folder, and spoke low enough that only the people in the first few rows could hear. But the effect rippled outward instantly. Karen's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing without sound as she scanned the documents. When she finally spoke, her voice was a thin thread. This is a misunderstanding. I've done nothing wrong." The officers didn't argue. They simply asked her to accompany them outside for a formal interview. No handcuffs, no raised voices, but the symbolism was crushing. Karen gathered her binder, knocking over the display stand as she stumbled, and followed them out, leaving the podium empty and the audience stunned into silence. Oliver waited by his truck, arms crossed as she passed. Their eyes met for the briefest second. Gone was the smug certainty, the veiled threats, the honeyed condescension. What remained was raw, naked fear, and somewhere deep behind that fear, he saw something else. Disbelief, as if she still couldn't quite grasp that her own actions, her own decisions, had led her here. When the doors of the investigator's car closed and they pulled away, Oliver exhaled slowly, feeling the tension bleed from his muscles. But he didn't linger in the glow of victory. There was still work to do. The aftermath unfolded quickly. Within 48 hours, the local news caught wind of the investigation, framing it not as a property dispute, but as a scandal. Grant fraud, abuse of power, ecological violations. Karen's face appeared in grainy photographs on news sites, accompanied by headlines that no amount of PR could soften. Several members of the board resigned in a flurry of carefully worded statements about taking responsibility and focusing on personal matters. Verde Plains, facing civil suits and the loss of future contracts, dissolved within a week, citing operational restructuring. Oliver's lawsuits proceeded methodically. Samantha Kerrigan was relentless, leveraging every documented violation, every contradictory statement, every missing permit to hammer their defenses into dust. Settlement offers trickled in, first tentative, then desperate. He rejected the early ones, letting them sweat, letting them realize just how much evidence stood against them. In the end, they didn't just offer to pay for the damage to his field. They offered to fund a full restoration project under the supervision of a certified ecological conservancy group, with Oliver retaining full ownership and control. They offered to cover legal fees, damages, and an additional settlement sum for emotional distress and reputational harm, and they agreed to publicly acknowledge in writing their wrongdoing. Oliver accepted, but not out of mercy. He accepted because it meant legal closure and public record, a permanent acknowledgement that what they had done could not be hidden, minimized, or rewritten. On the morning the restoration crews arrived, real experts this time, with actual conservation credentials, Oliver stood once again at the edge of his land. He watched as they unloaded equipment designed not for destruction but for healing: soil stabilizers, native plant seedlings, moisture retention systems. It would take years to undo the damage fully, years to coax back what careless ambition had torn apart. But it would happen, patiently, relentlessly, just like he had fought them. He turned toward the modest wooden sign he had installed at the entrance, carved by hand over the winter while the battles raged around him. It bore no slogans, no accusations, no self-congratulation, only a simple message: private land, protected by stewardship, not permission. He smiled, small and real, and walked the perimeter of his field, feeling the frost-softened soil give gently beneath his boots. The land was wounded, but not broken. And neither was he. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it brought a kind of quiet triumph with it. Oliver's field, scarred and battered though it had been, began to stir again with stubborn, patient life. Small green shoots forced their way through the disturbed soil where crews had replanted native seeds under his supervision, and tentative splashes of color returned along the ridges where the goldenrod and prairie clover had once thrived. Restoration wasn't immediate, and it wasn't perfect. Some parts of the land would bear the scars for years. Some damage might never be fully undone. But it was happening, stubbornly, inevitably, just as Oliver had known it would if given the chance. The settlement money from the lawsuits had been carefully apportioned. Part of it paid for the restoration teams, for materials, for ongoing monitoring and stewardship support through the university's ecology department. Part of it went into a conservation trust fund that Oliver established specifically for the protection of small, privately owned habitats around the county. Quiet patches of life like his own, too often ignored or sacrificed in the name of progress. The rest he used to reinforce the boundaries of his land, not with walls or fences, but with a formal conservation easement, a legal designation that would make it nearly impossible for future developers or committees to encroach again. His land was now, by law and by spirit, a place set aside, not for sale, not for barter, not for compromise. Karen Hobbs faded from public life with remarkable speed. No dramatic apologies, no redemption arcs. After the settlements and investigations concluded, she resigned from her various civic committees under the polite fiction of health reasons, and sold her home 6 months later. Rumor had it she moved several counties over, closer to family, though no one Oliver knew seemed particularly concerned with where she ended up. The community board was gutted and restructured, and though Oliver refused every invitation to join the new iteration, he maintained a respectful working relationship with a few of its more sincere members. He wasn't interested in titles or politics. His business was with the land. Neighbors who had once whispered or stared now greeted him with cautious respect. Some offered quiet apologies in their own way, a wave from a porch, a short nod while passing on the road, an extra loaf of bread left at his gate during holidays. Oliver accepted these gestures for what they were, acknowledgments, not reparations. Trust, once broken, didn't mend easily, but it didn't need to. He wasn't looking for validation from people who had doubted him when it mattered. He wasn't looking for anything at all except the peace he had carved out with his own hands. One evening, as the last light bled out of the sky and the air cooled with the scent of fresh earth, Oliver walked the perimeter of his field. The new sapling swayed gently in the breeze, slender and resilient. Somewhere near the creek bed, a nighthawk called out, its voice rough and defiant against the settling dark. Oliver paused by the wooden sign he had erected, weathered now, its lettering softened by rain and wind, and rested his hand lightly against it. Private land, protected by stewardship, not permission. It wasn't defiance anymore. It wasn't even anger. It was simply the truth, standing quietly, needing no defense. He moved on, walking the boundary as he did every evening, not to guard against intrusions, those battles were done, but to affirm his connection to the place, to remind himself that ownership was not domination, but responsibility. The land had been wounded by greed and negligence, and he had fought to heal it not just because it was his, but because it was worth fighting for, because it mattered, in a way no sidewalk or playground or jogging trail ever could. He thought of the years ahead, the slow work of nurturing the fields back to full strength, the seasonal rhythms returning with cautious persistence, the quiet satisfaction of seeing something once nearly destroyed reborn through stubborn care. There would be setbacks, of course. There always were. But Oliver understood now, better than he ever had, that resilience wasn't dramatic or loud. It was the simple, unbreakable choice to stay rooted where you belonged, to tend what was yours, even when it was easier to let it die. As darkness closed in, he made his way back toward the house. The old porch light cast a soft halo around the door, and the fields beyond lay in deepening shadow, alive with unseen motion. Life didn't announce itself with fanfare. It returned quietly, steadily, without seeking permission. And so did he.